Welcome to MacroHive Conversations with Bilal Hafiz. MacroHive helps educate investors and provide investment insights for all markets from crypto to equities to bonds. For our latest views, visit macrohive.com. So greetings and welcome, Diane. It's fantastic to have you on the podcast show.
Thank you for inviting me.
Now, Diane, amongst other things, you're an expert on how to measure progress. In fact, you wrote a book earlier this year, The Measure of Progress, Counting What Really Matters, which is a fantastic book, and I'd recommend that to everyone to read. And I guess at some level, what you're saying is the measures we look at, notably GDP, which seems to be the benchmark around the world, is inadequate. I mean, can you kind of, at a high level, explain why you think GDP and sort of equivalent type measures is not fit for purpose right now?
There are two halves to that answer. And one is that even on its own terms, GDP isn't doing a very good job. And that's because the data that are collected about the digital economy are completely inadequate. So there are whole aspects of the way the economy operates now that are invisible. How much people are using AI, for instance, would be the topical aspect of that. But things like how do we treat the free services that we all use, the search and so on, there's no consensus about how to put that into the figures. How does supply chains operate across national borders? The trade figures that we have don't reflect those supply chains. And so we get taken by surprise when there are shocks like the pandemic or the energy crisis. So even on its own terms, GDP is not doing a good job of reflecting how the economy is today. But the other aspect of it, the other half of it, is all of those familiar criticisms of GDP, if you like, that it doesn't take account of what people do outside the paid economy that's really valuable. It doesn't take account of the way that we're depleting natural assets and not paying the full price for environmental damage that's caused. So all of those sort of emissions from things that we know make a really important economic contribution, and they're definitely part of how you would think about whether the economy is progressing or not. They've been left out for a long time, and that's still a very valid critique, and some of those are becoming more acute than before as well. So on both fronts, the picture we get from what's happening to GDP growth is just a really inadequate picture for either businesses or governments to make decisions.
And if we start on the first point, say something like the digital economy, and let's take something like search, Google search, or some kind of search engine which everybody uses. It seems to have improved people's lives in some ways, I imagine, or consuming videos on YouTube and those sorts of things. How do they currently get captured in GDP or economic statistics?
So anything that's a paid transaction in principle gets captured in GDP statistics. So the wages of people who are in those companies, or the money that they spend on the services and the electricity they buy, they're there in the figures somewhere. But the actual service of search provision or whatever isn't, because there's no price paid, there's no direct price paid for it. And yet people really value it. So if you use other techniques, such as willingness to pay techniques, how much would people be willing to pay for it, or how much would they need to be paid to have it taken away? A couple in particular, Google search and personal email, really highly valued by lots of people. So that there's this important economic activity that is changing business models and the way we spend our time daily, spend hours online daily. That's not captured, and nobody can quite agree how to do so. So the formal standard for measuring GDP is that United Nations process. We agreed a new set of standards in 2025, and they just haven't answered that question. So it's still a bit of a gap. And I think it matters because if you think about how we're talking about AI now, there are two discourses, aren't there? One is going to take all the jobs, and the other is psycho chatbots are out to kill you. But what's it actually doing for the creation of economic value? Who knows? Because those things aren't being measured. How much are companies using AI? What are they doing with it? What are consumers doing with it that's different? What kind of value is it creating? A bit of a gap.
And, I guess this goes to a broader issue around services, so even before the digital economy, I mean, how does one measure the output of a service like a lawyer or an accountant, or I work in the finance sector. So, I interact a lot with traders, bankers, and asset managers, and so on. And I've always thought, when you say productivity, which is linked to GDP, productivity is going up in the service sector. Like, does that, like, say for a lawyer, what does that mean exactly? With manufacturing, it's a bit clearer. Input, output. It seems a bit clearer. But with services more generally, even sort of pre-digital, that I've always found it quite a slippery sort of concept.
Yeah. You're quite right, and I think even in manufacturing, people in business don't recognise the kind of concept of productivity that economists use. But in services in particular, so in finance, notoriously, the biggest contribution to GDP growth from the financial sector was the final quarter of 2008, and that's because a big part of the measurement of the sector is essentially the spread, the interest rate spread on trades, and so it's measuring risk taking, and risk taking was high, but that's not what we would really mean by a kind of productive contribution to the economy. But as you're saying, I completely agree with you about things like professional services. If you take a management consultant, you can't think about what's the unit of output and the price of that unit of output in the way that you can for washing machines, because you're not going to count their the length of their PowerPoint decks. It has been billable hours. A lot of professional services have a billable hours model, which is really going back to labor theory of value. The value you create depends on the labor you put into it. That's being undermined by AI, obviously, because to the extent that you can now in those professions do something in 6 minutes rather than 6 hours, that's fewer hours that you can bill for. So going to be interesting to see how that works out. But you're right. Somebody who taught me when I was doing my PhD had this construct of hard to measure sectors of the economy. And at the time he wrote it in 1994, this was V. Grillicus. It was 2/3 of the economy was hard to measure in his categorization. And when I updated it for my book, it's 4/5 of the economy is hard to measure, which to me says with going about measuring it the wrong way.
Absolutely. And one of the things you talk about in your book is prices. So there's the nominal value of the economy, which you could say is just whatever people are paying. But then we, as economists, we want to deflate everything, look at everything in real terms, which just allows a better measure of things. And I think you said something like, is it like half of the prices that are used in GDP and other measures is imputed or not actual real prices or something like that?
Well, a lot of GDP is imputed, and the big category of that is the rent we would pay ourselves as owner occupiers if we were renting our house instead.
Okay.
But also things like government services don't have prices attached to them, and so that does add up to quite a large portion of the economy. But the idea of real terms is a little bit of a kind of intellectual construct anyway, because what you can actually count is the pounds or the dollars or the euros that people spend. So that's the sort of real bit. But then we want to translate it into some kind of concept of what are the actual resources that need to be used to produce this economic output. But that's why I think thinking about the time people spend is quite an interesting alternative framework. Because it's an accounting framework. There's 24 hours, they've got to be spent. You can't carry them over to the next day. And you can think about, as individuals, as consumers, how do we spend our time and how enjoyable is that or how valuable is that? And then on the production side, you can think about services whose quality matters. And so spending a lot of time of high quality is the value that's being delivered. And in other areas, speeding things up is the value that's being delivered. And a lot of technical changes over history have been about speeding things up. That's where we get productivity growth from.
And if we were to use a time use sort of type survey, and is that practically possible to kind of scale this up, and do this systematically and regularly? I can't recall, but in the US they do it annually, I think, or something like that.
So there are time use surveys. We in the UK do one occasionally, and they have been done for consumers. They're all about the consumer side, and they're mainly trying to understand household production. And that's interesting now because there's more household production going on. So people doing open source software or uploading videos to YouTube for other people's entertainment. That's economic production with no price attached. There's more of that. That's substituting for things that used to happen in the market. So that's interesting anyway. What hasn't been covered in time use surveys is what people do at work. There is a UK time use survey for public sector workers, which they did as a one-off. And that's kind of interesting because it shows you in broad brush terms how public servants spend their time and how much time they think they waste on useless meetings and so on. But we need to extend the time use surveys quite a lot to deliver a time use framework. And people talk about that as if it's an insuperable problem. I don't think it is. I mean, most of the economic data in GDP comes from surveys. That's kind of being undermined by very decreasing survey response rates. And people focus on the labour force survey in the individuals, that the response rate there has tanked. But it's true in business surveys as well. The response rates are diminishing. And I think the old methods of collecting GDP data are going to fade before too long.
And actually on the sort of declining survey response rate, I mean, what do you think's contributing to that, and what's a remedy for that or an alternative to that?
It's a good question. I'm not sure I've got a definitive answer. I mean, we all get a million surveys a day by email these days, so there's definitely survey fatigue at the individual level. I'm not quite sure about businesses. I mean, I guess if I were a business in the US now, I'd be very uncertain about providing confidential data to the American agencies because they've been politicized. And the independence of statistical agencies is important for the trust that people have in handing over confidential data to them. Maybe it's just people in business are too pressed for time as well. And so we're going to have to find different ways of collecting data fundamentally.
I mean, do you think there is like a technology solution to that in some ways to monitor, to sort of capture this data? I mean, people always try to find technology solutions for everything, but do you think there is something feasible? Are other countries doing it in some way that we could copy in the UK or in other countries in the OECD?
It's going to have to be the way to go. And all the agencies are thinking about using scanner data to get at consumer spending and prices rather than sending people around to survey prices or asking consumers retrospectively what did they spend on. There are new types of data, satellite data, mobile data that might be feasible to use. Looking at business-to-business transactions data, that's starting to be done. So I think there will be, for quite a lot of the waterfront, a way of automating data feeds and developing the methods to use that data instead of the old-fashioned surveys. But it's quite a big agenda, and it requires quite a lot of resource for the statistical agencies, and they're all being squeezed. So not sure when it will happen.
And I mean, when I listen to all of this now, I mean, it just makes me wonder, like, what are the statistics telling me? It tells me like it's only a very partial picture of things. And so what have we been doing for the last 10, 20 years when we've been obsessing about, like, is growth gone up or down, or this stat's gone up or down, and we're just missing something that's happening in society as a result?
I think this always happens at a time when the structure of the economy is changing a lot. And I've got a facsimile edition of the 1885 UK Handbook of Statistics, which is 120 pages, of which 12 cover all the phenomena of the Industrial Revolution. 1885, it had been around for a bit. People knew there were factories and stuff going on, and coal mines and the railways and so on. But it was almost all agricultural statistics and very detailed trade statistics for agriculture that were still being collected. And so I think we're in one of those periods when the framework matches the old economy, as it hasn't caught up to the new economy yet. And so you can't see what's going on now through the existing framework.
And, another thing you talk about in your book is wealth, and do we adequately capture or measure wealth in the right way? And I guess we tend to focus on sort of income statement type statistics rather than balance sheet statistics. And so why the focus on wealth, and how do we currently measure it?
So the idea is exactly that. As you say, it's having a balance sheet and you might think this is less important than the profit and loss of a company, but you need to know what's on the balance sheet, and all kinds of bad things get hidden there. So it fundamentally tells you about sustainability. So sustainability for me is not just environmental issues, although measuring natural capital is part of what we need to understand. That has very hard-edged economic consequences. If soil quality goes down across the east of England, agricultural productivity will go down. So it's not warm and cuddly. But thinking about what's the range of assets you need in the economy for it to continue to produce economically valuable stuff, services, and goods, so that people in future have at least as high a living standard as we do. That's progress for me, sustainability. So natural capital, as well as all the infrastructure and physical capital, the factories and the machines. But human capital is an important one. Agencies measure it, but not in a balance sheet way. And they look at educational qualifications, but not at health. And I think one lesson from the pandemic and the subsequent withdrawal from the labour market of some people is you've got to think about health as part of human capital as well. And then this sort of broader concept of, it's got different titles in the literature, but social capital or organizational capital or kind of ideas, intangible capital. I was listening to the head of strategy at Dell give a public talk, and he said that their key asset was their organizational capital. It was how they get the exact kind of computer the consumer wants through this very complicated supply and logistics chain to them in a timely way. And that's really hard to define and measure, but he saw it as their fundamental economic advantage. So I'm very interested in that research agenda of understanding organizations and how institutions, which in a broad brush sense we know sustain economic growth or not, how do we think about understanding and measuring that better?
And just if we touched on some of those points on the human capital side, education is a common metric used, but we have seen in recent years that higher qualifications doesn't necessarily translate to the same earnings potential that people once thought it would. So, do we also need to then make assumptions around the link between education, say, or even health and income outcomes to correctly value that capital? So, well, I mean, like if you kind of scrape between, underneath, you realize that actually it's hard to price capital then in that way.
Yeah, it's a good question. I suppose what we really want to understand is what are the set of capabilities that humans have that will enable them to do things that are valuable for themselves and others. And so one question might be, educational qualifications capture quite a narrow slice of those capabilities. If AI is substituting for some of those capabilities that are measured by degrees or A-levels, what should we be thinking about other types of emotional intelligence or creativity and so on? Should we be thinking about that? And so one question is just how do you define it? For all of these capital assets as well, there's a big question about how do you value them? So natural capital, there's actually a lot of statistical machinery around measuring that. But then how do you put a price on clean air is another really difficult question. And so the pushback I get from other economists when I advocate starting to measure capitals better is it's just too hard. There are these really philosophical questions and it's too difficult. So we'll carry on doing what we're doing. Thank you.
And then on the social capital side, like the intangible side, I mean, one thing I think about often is something like, these social media companies, whose asset is, say, the social network that they own, the network map, the social graph that they have. And so when you look at the balance sheet, it doesn't really appear, it's not a factory or anything, but it's incredibly powerful sort of asset. And so maybe one could think about it as the difference between the market cap of the company minus the book value of the balance sheet, could be some measure of the intangible asset, measures like that. I mean, do you think that type of approach would make sense, or are we would it then get caught up in market fads then and would end up with the sort of overly fluctuating measure of our capital?
So that kind of technique has been used by economists for some examples, and I've done one with a co-author looking at the value of data that companies use. to look at the market cap of data intensive and not data intensive companies. I mean, as you say, it can fluctuate quite a lot, but in a sense, that's not a bad thing. It is a market price which economists prefer, and there are tipping points in these kinds of values. We've seen lots of examples of companies' values going plummeting on the stock market because it reflects, a real collapse in the economic value they can deliver. So if X ever gets to the point where its social graph collapses because it's so horrible, that will happen really quickly. And having a big fluctuation in price is the right way to reflect that.
And, in your book, you say measure of progress. And so in your mind, I mean, how do you define progress?
So first of all, sustainable, so that it lasts over time and future generations are at least as well off as we are. And beyond that, I'm an economist, so I always root it back in people's preferences and what kind of life do people want to lead. The conventional economics is that you're very utilitarian about it. You specify what gives people utility and you stick to that preference map. I like the Amartya Sen capabilities approach. And so I think of it as what are people able to do? What are you enabling them to do that will keep them happy? And then you don't have to go to, I need to know what people's preferences are. They're very different. People have got all kinds of different aims and likes in life. But thinking about that capability set, what is the economy offering them the opportunity to do that will give them a sense of well-being and progress? That was philosophical, but
Yeah. And then when you look at, say, a country like the UK, I mean, if you were like in charge of like picking the right targets to look at, or you had a budget to sort of, create the right tools and statistics, I mean, what would the first sort of sets of things you'd focus on be?
Well, GDP is not terrible. It's correlated with lots of things we care about. So we've got to have some GDP growth. We've not had a lot at all, and that's definitely not good. And looking at more straightforward figures like what's the distribution, who's getting the extra GDP that's being created, that's clearly important now. I would be looking at sort of inputs to people's lives actually at the moment, because the outcome measurement is so up in the air. I would be looking at things like what infrastructure can people access, and what educational opportunities are available to people. So those are the kinds of things that are going to increase whatever measure of progress you end up with as the outcome. And like you, I'm really not clear how to interpret a lot of the figures that we get day to day. And I certainly wish people would stop going, oh, GDP is up by 0.2% this quarter, things are fine. Because that's just absurd. And there's this kind of media merry-go-round of pouncing on quarterly figures that will get revised massively in future.
And in terms of your research right now, I mean, what's your big areas of focus now? I mean, you've written this book recently, which presumably is a culmination of many years of work. I mean, what's your big research focuses at the moment, your research agenda?
I've been looking at the digital economy since the mid-1990s, so I'm very excited about looking at the AI economy and understanding what's happening there. On the measurement front, I'm interested in looking more closely at data and intangible capital, to think about how do we conceptualize that in ways that we can translate better into things that we could actually measure in some way. And there are kind of existing frameworks in the literature for categorizing intangibles, and I'm not sure that's quite the right way to think about it. So I'm pondering that as well. But, broadly, AI, is it going to make us better off or not?
Yeah, that's fantastic. Well, final question is, if people wanted to follow your work, what's the best way for them to do that?
Well, Bennett School of Public Policy is my academic home, so please do follow us. And it's not just me, it's all kinds of great researchers here. And then I've got a blog where I write about books I read called The Enlightened Economist.
That's fantastic. So, well, once again, thanks a lot for the excellent conversation. And thanks again for the book as well that you've written. I'd urge our listeners to get a hold of it. And good luck with all your future research endeavors.
Thank you so much. Really enjoyed the conversation.
Thanks for listening to the episode. Please subscribe to the podcast show on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Leave a 5-star rating, a nice comment, and let other people know about the show. We'd be super grateful. Finally, sign up for our free newsletter at macrohive.com/free. That's macrohive.com/free. We'll be back soon, so tune in then.